Okay, welcome back. We are now starting chapter 16. Here we go. The students who would play 55 song took their places in the music room the next day. Many of the students sat off to the side to observe. Even the lowest notes of violins, clarinets, and trumpets were too high for Blue 55. I was surprised the tuba player wasn't participating. That was one of the few instruments I'd listed since it could play notes even lower than 55s. But Mr. Russell said that note I needed was hard to play and he didn't have a student who could do it. So it took more skill than I thought if you couldn't play it, the note by holding your hands in the right place and blowing into the mouthpiece alone. Before you leave, I'll show you a way you can create the sound on a phone or a tablet, he wrote on a sticky note. Listed on the whiteboard were instruments participating in the notes they'd play. I waited in a chair at the front of the room while the group did a couple of practice rounds. It looked like the students were checking something on their phones or some other small device after playing a note, sometimes shaking their heads and playing again. Mr. Russell played the piano and pointed to each student in turn, directing them to play the notes that matched 55 hertz. They played the ones just above or below that too, since Blue 55 sometimes sang a little higher or lower. A few students watching the performance covered their ears. Hopefully it would sound better to Blue 55. Behind the rows of blue plastic chairs were the students with larger instruments. A boy with shaggy blonde hair played the bass saxophone. I recognized Angelica Freeman because she lived a few houses down from me. She moved the fingers of one hand along the neck of an upright bass, the instrument I'd always thought was an overgrown violin. Her other hand worked the bow back and forth across the strings. After a few minutes, Mr. Russell said something to the group, then stood up from the piano bench and wrote, "Ready for the real thing," on the board. Mr. Russell turned on the microphones and stereo equipment. Later, he'd email me the recording of the song. If the room didn't have deep wall-to-wall carpet, I could have taken off my shoes and feel the vibrations of the music, like of the bass drum that sat on the floor. I wondered what all those instruments sounded like together, then reminded myself it was like the song of 55 I had felt on my computer speakers at home. I just wished I could feel it then. Instead of sitting down again after pressing the record button, Mr. Russell pointed to me and then to the piano bench. I pointed to my chest. "Me?" He nodded, then wrote, "It's your song, only fair you get to play it." I smiled and sat at the bench. Playing Blue 55's song was even better than hearing it. Mr. Russell made a tapping motion near the correct key, but I already knew which note to play. I placed a finger on the 13th key, then looked up to wait for his cue. When he waved his hands, I tapped the piano key over and over while the other students played their notes. I played the 12th and the 14th key also, to add the sounds just above and below the 55 hertz. Mr. Russell raised a hand, then made a fist. After we paused the recording, everyone applauded, even the students who'd been covering their ears. Maybe they were just clapping because it was over, but I didn't mind. We had the song that would tell 55 someone was out there. As the students took their seats for their regular practice, Mr. Russell showed me an app on his tablet. He held the phone near the piano and pointed to the 13th key. When I tapped it, the phone's microphone picked up the sound. Wavy lines appeared on the screen along with the name of the note, A1. Best of all, a readout of the frequency, 55 hertz, appeared next to the sound wave with each strike of the key. Mr. Russell pointed to the students to show me that they were using the similar apps. That was how they knew if they hit the right note. Already I felt closer to Blue 55 from playing that sound like the one he sang. Mr. Russell showed me how to adjust a wheel on the screen to select any musical instrument. That was what he meant when he said I could play the tuba note myself. He spun the wheel to tuba, then showed me which note to tap. Purple lines of a sound wave and 55 hertz appeared in the middle of the screen. I should have known there'd be an app that would allow me to play the song. Instead of working with the music students, I could have created the song myself, but it wasn't so bad working with them. Now that they knew about Blue 55 too, it was like I had more people listening to him. Before I left, I drew a smiling whale on the whiteboard saying, "Thanks, everyone." Some of the kids smiled and waved at me as I left, and Angelica gave me a thumbs up. Okay, maybe playing music wasn't worthless. So before this, she had talked about how music was so worthless because she can't hear the sounds. And now she's changing her mind. While I waited at home for Mr. Russell to finish band practice and email me the file, I tried out the tuner app he'd showed me. I worked in the study so I could use the computer speakers. Usually Mom worked at home doing graphic design, but that day she was at a meeting with a company she did some work for. Whenever I found a note that was around 55 hertz, I recorded the sound on my computer. I scrolled through the selection of instruments, some of which I'd never heard of, like the euphonium. By playing with this plus minus buttons, marked octave, I got a few more instruments to hit the right sound. I threw in a few notes from 50 to 60 hertz to give Blue 55 a little variety. How long could practice go on? Just when I was thinking Mr. Russell had forgotten about me, the email came through. I opened the attached file and hit play. The vibrations coming from the speaker reminded me of 55's song. Maybe it would remind 55 of his song too. The other sound files I needed were in a new email from Andy. Dear Iris, great to hear from you again. I made underwater recordings today with the hydrophones and I've attached the file here. Often it's noisier than what I recorded for you, but we don't have any cruise ships coming in today, so it's mostly natural sounds here, such as a humpback and blue whales, orcas, seals, and the wind on the ocean's surface. Good luck with your project. I'm interested in hearing more about it. Andy. Yep, you'll be hearing about it, Andy. The recording was only about 5 minutes long. I'd have to do some editing so Blue 55 would have a longer song to listen to. After I dragged the clips from Mr. Russell and Andy into a new file, I copied them over and over so they would play for an hour. Hopefully it would be enough. I placed my hand over the speaker and closed my eyes while the song played. I thought before that playing 55's real song wouldn't do any good because he'd recognize it as his own, but I wonder what would happen if it was mixed in with the new music. I added a clip of Blue 55's recording to the middle of the song I just arranged. There, something familiar yet different. A bit of his own song woven into the new one. It was impossible to make the song exactly like 55's, but I did my best to stretch out the notes or clips so that they'd match the pattern of his music. I'd read that whale songs were made up of units, like single moans, chirps, or cries put together to build phrases. A bunch of phrases made a theme, like spoken words that made up sentences and then paragraphs, or like signs that made up phrases and conversations or poems or stories. Maybe 55 would know his story was for him. After all that work, I had to sit there for a while to figure out my reply. This would be the most important message I'd ever written. It had to be just right. Here's her reply. Dear Andy, thanks so much for sending the recording of the sanctuary animals. It's just what I needed for my project. I haven't stopped thinking about Blue 55 since I first learned about him from my science teacher, Sophia Amelia. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I wanted to tell her my plan without making it seem like I thought I was smarter than the sanctuary staff. Since it didn't work out last time you tried to put a tracker on him, I thought you might like this idea I came up with. I told her how I worked with the musicians at the school to record a song at Blue 55's frequency and then mixed it with his own song and the sounds of the sanctuary animals. A sound file of the song is attached here. What you could do is play it while you're on the boat and plug a set of waterproof speakers into the whatever device you're using. Then you can drop the speaker into the water and 55 will hear the song. You said he swims to the other whales, right? And they're not even singing the same songs? I'm sure when he hears something that sounds like him, he'll follow and he'll want to hang around for a while. I thought about how whenever I was with another deaf person, we'd take forever saying our goodbyes. It annoyed everyone else as they stood in the doorway waiting for us to finally say goodbye and mean it. We'd almost get there, then think of something else to tell each other. If you don't know when you're going to talk to someone you like again or that's like you don't want to waste your time together and you don't want it to end. Whenever he's near your sanctuary, this song can help him feel at home. Maybe other sanctuaries could play it too, like when he migrates to warmer areas. He won't feel so alone hearing something like himself out there. I don't know how many times I reread that email to make sure it looked right. It had to be professional, but casual too, as if we sort of knew each other and were working for the same thing. I kept editing the message, changing words here and there, and then changing them back again. Finally, I did it. I held my breath and clicked send. Your song is on the way, Blue 55. That's the end of chapter 16. Chapter 17. I wanted to see Wendell in person to update him about the whale song. After school the next day, I called on the video phone to ask if I could come over. He said if I hurried, I could ride with him and his mom to junior high. Miss Jackson had been absent from work that day because of some meetings, so she went to stop by her classroom to prepare for the next day. On the long drive to Bridgewood Junior High, I told Wendell all about the recording Blue 55 song and sending it to the sanctuary. That's so cool. Did you hear back yet? Not yet. It hasn't been that long though. I tried not to worry about not getting a message from Andy yet, even though it hadn't been a whole day. I kept checking my email for a reply. What if my idea really wasn't that great? Just because the song would be at 55's frequency, that didn't mean it would make sense to him. An image popped into my head of Nina's waving hands asking a whale, "Hey, how's the plankton?" Creating something that annoyed Blue 55 would be worse than not making the song at all. The junior high started later than we did, so students were still in class when we got to Bridgewood. On the way to Miss Jackson's classroom, I stopped and backed up when some signing hands in a science classroom caught my eye. An interpreter signed to one of the groups of students at a tall black table as the teacher talked to them. They weren't the only deaf students in the room. At another table, 3 students signed to one another as they worked. I wanted to jump into the conversation about the electrical circuit they were building. Miss Jackson went on to her class while Wendell waited for me in the hallway. A woman approached the deaf students and signed to them. It didn't seem like she was an interpreter. She just joined in on the discussion and asked what they were to do next. "Who is that woman?" I asked Wendell. "Miss Martinez. The class with a lot of deaf students has a deaf ed teacher in the room along with a regular teacher. She signs like a deaf person, probably because she's deaf." "They have deaf teachers here?" "Yeah, a few." Wendell took my hand and pulled me away from the science class. 2 students walked by us in the hallway, signing with each other. They waved hi to Wendell as they passed. I had known that most deaf kids went to Bridgewood, but I didn't expect to see so many. They'd be able to sign with one another all the time, like during class or PE games or in the hallways, at the lunch table. Miss Jackson was leaving her classroom with some books and a file folder when we got there. "I'm going to the workroom to make copies for tomorrow's lessons. You 2 can wait here." Everyone in the room knew Wendell since he had been there with his mom before. After he introduced me, I wandered around and scanned the bookshelves while Wendell chatted with other people in the room. A few kids sat at a half-circle table with another teacher who shared the room with Miss Jackson. Other students worked at their desks or computers. In one corner of the room, a TV top with a video phone sat at the wheeled back cart. I pulled a book from the shelf. It looked old, with just a plain off-white cover, but it was a title that drew me in. American Sign Language, a history. I hadn't noticed Wendell standing next to me until he moved his hands. My mom uses that when she teaches deaf history. Deaf history? Yeah, it's interesting. I never thought about deaf people having a history or where our language came from. Wendell reached for the book and flipped to the beginning. I scanned the page he turned to, then read the caption beneath a picture of a white-haired man dressed in black signing with a little girl. "France?" I signed. He nodded. Some French people came here and used their sign language to teach deaf kids. There was just one school for a long time, so deaf people from all over the country went there and shared their signs with one another. And that's the sign language we use now? It took a while, and it changes all the time, but yeah, that became ASL, a new language, from groups who couldn't understand each other at first. Why hadn't I known that? Maybe Blue 55 and I would understand each other just a little, just one sound. And I'm going to stop right there because I need to end the video so I can upload it, and then we'll continue next.